Anton Piatigorsky, a writer of plays, libretti, and now short stories, is a native of DC, as many of you probably know, and now lives in Toronto. He has won the Dora Maver Moore Award, the Summer Works Prize, and the Eleanor and Lou Simovich Protege Award. The Iron Bridge, his first collection of short stories, follows several dictators through parts of their youth, using historical incidents as a base. While they stand on their own, these engaging stories take on an extra layer of meaning with our knowledge of later events, more or less so, depending on how much attention you paid in history class. There's a fascinating juxtaposition between the ominous future and the unformed possibilities of youth, which I found enhanced by the eerily endearing nicknames that several of the dictators have. Avoiding a sense of inevitability, Anton has crafted these stories with intelligence and subtlety. Please join me in welcoming Anton Piatigorsky.
So I would like to talk about a number of things. There's so many different things that I could say about these dictators, both about their psychologies, about their historical settings, their contexts, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss all those things in the question period. But first thing that I'd like to just talk about briefly and then read a little bit from the book. I was thinking about why I actually spent a couple of years writing this, and I thought I knew for a while, but then I realized that I hadn't really given thought about what it was particularly that had me interested in writing about them as opposed to just reading about them, studying them. And I realized that one quality that they all have that is of particular fascination to me is this desire to mythologize themselves. These stories that they told about themselves with such desperation, and then projected that story onto the world in such a large way, in such a historical way. This is a quality that is not just limited to dictators. It's something that we see in society all the time. I mean, everybody tells stories about themselves and kind of creates their own identity through their self-story and how they manipulate their self-story. And artists do it, and politicians do it, and dictators certainly do it to a large extent. And it's something that I've always had a bit of a morbid fascination with. It's not a quality I particularly like. I feel like it's something that people do to deceive themselves. It causes more problems than it helps. But it's something that particularly interests me. And these dictators in particular did it at such a very, very large scale level. And it was so deeply important to themselves and then also to their effect and role on history. That said, I became particularly interested in their adolescence for similar reasons. When they got older, they were in many ways calcified people. And in reading their biographies or reading history, I found myself often bored by them later. They were so bad, and they were so clear about what they were, who they were, why they were doing it, that in many ways they lack a certain kind of drama. And even in a lot of the fiction that I've read, which treats dictators at later periods in their lives, I often feel that same sort of calcification about them, where there's no possibility of them being a different person. But in adolescence, there is, of course, really a possibility of being any number of people. And yet at the same time, you are enough of who you are that you're trending in a certain way. So there are these characteristics that are starting to manifest. So adolescence seemed like the really interesting time for me. It's the time when they're forming their stories and forming themselves, but it's also the time when they really didn't have to become bad people. And there's an element of, even if they had all sorts of problems, they didn't have to become such bad people. So there's this element of free will that's at play there in that age. Another part of it also in terms of their self-mythologizing that interests me is when they were in adolescence, as we all are. I mean, very few of us have any real power. And so as much as they wanted to spin these stories around themselves, reality was constantly fighting against them. I mean, they would have these very grandiose senses of who they are and what they could be, or they were in development. But at the same time, reality was constantly giving them a different message about who they were and what their possibilities were. So there's a great point of tension there that was interesting to me, and it made them fight all the more to try to create themselves and create their mythologies around themselves. That said, I was very interested in writing stories that were small in scale. I didn't want to write stories that they all have traces of the kinds of activities and the kinds of thinking and actions that they used on a large scale later in their lives, but essentially the kind of dramas and the kind of problems and events they were going through in their adolescences were smaller scale problems, and that was interesting to me for a few reasons. Primarily, it's a bit of an opposite from a dictatorial act. I mean, when these people were dictators, this is across the board. They had a way of deifying themselves and dehumanizing everybody else. So these a dictatorial state will have a leader or a group of people, and their will is law, and their word is the word of a god, and they believe it. The state believes it. Whereas everybody else is completely dehumanized. They don't matter. They're irrelevant, and they're just pawns to be used by these godlike forces. To humanize dictators, or to humanize anybody, is the opposite. It's inherently a democratic thing. It's saying that everybody's equal, saying that we're all having the same kind of desires and effects on our lives, and the same process of self-mythologizing, or the same process of storytelling. So I really wanted to ground these stories in ways that undermined the act of mythologizing, that humanized in a way that, and part of that humanization, part of that is showing that they wanted to self-mythologize, but still showing it in a human way, showing that their desires were small, their needs were within the realm that's something that we could understand, even if their actions and the events and their consequences ended up being so huge and destructive for the world. So I'm going to read a little bit from a story called Incensed, which was about Hitler. In the story, I've called him Idi, as he was known when he was 16. I picked this segment just because it has a little bit of about... You get a glimpse into somebody who's mythologizing and trying to create a story around himself. So he's living with his mother in Austria, in a small town in Austria, and his father has died about a year or two ago, and he's at a period in his life where he had very grand ambitions about being an artist and an architect, and he dropped out of school. He was living at home with these elaborate fantasies about his importance and his artistic vision, and he was really given free license to do whatever he wanted. His mother was very meek around him and very accommodating of his needs and desires. So at the point where I'm going to just start the story, he's just finished breakfast, and his mother has asked him in a very sort of tentative way if he has any plans for the day, and here's how he responds. "No plans until evening," Adi tells his mother, glaring at her in defiance. "I'm busy with my work." "Adi," Clara whispers. He throws his head back and groans. "Mother," he says with a sigh. He stiffens as he approaches her. "I've explained to you many times that the production of great art is a fickle, haphazard, and mysterious process. It cannot in any way be compared to other kinds of work." Adi takes Clara's trembling hands and holds them still. "It is a terrible mistake to judge an artist by the same standard as one would judge an artisan." "But why can't you find a trade?" Clara responds, her wide eyes moistening, "and still work at your painting, like Gustel with his music? Your father, hallowed be his memory, would not approve of this behavior. He would have not liked it one bit." Adi releases his mother's hands and steps back to face her. "My dear mother," he says, with firm but condescending sweetness, "Father so prized efficiency because his job required that particular skill of him. It's the same for all those custom officials. Time itself is the gold standard whereby their every action is judged. If a case is processed quickly, it's a success, pure and simple. efficiency for that whole lot of bureaucrats in the civil service, why, it's the only means for them to determine success or failure. He retakes his mother's hands and kisses 2 of her fingernails. Not so with art, he says, his blue eyes bulging at her. Not so with art. Repeating the phrase with greater animation makes it sound all the more convincing. Instead of being soothed by her son's explanation, Clara lowers her head and starts to tremble and cry. Her hands shake in his grip. Poor little mother is so like a bird who struck the glass, or perhaps fallen out of her nest onto the busy street below, just a delicate feather-light bird, soon to be crushed under the boot of an oblivious passer-by, unless, of course, Adi scoops her up and protects her, nurses her back to health. He squeezes his mother's fingers and forces her to look up at him. I will tell you a secret, mother, he says. Clara sniffles and swallows, but listens. I will tell you a secret at the risk of tempting fate, he repeats, his eyes growing wider. I will tell you a magnificent secret. Adi releases his mother's hands and disappears into his room. Clara brushes away her tears with her knuckles and waits for Adi to return. When he does, he is holding his lottery ticket. Here, he says, handing it to her. You see? Clara stares at the card with its embossed digits and the Habsburg icon, unsure of what exactly she's supposed to see. I have won, says Adi, tapping the paper. The lottery. Clara's childlike face opens in astonishment. You have? She asks, her voice rising to a cry. I've won the lottery, he repeats, now pressing his lips together and letting his eyes widen. You've really won the lottery? Their faces are moving closer and closer together with each iteration of that magnetic statement. Are you certain? I've won, he says again. I was in bed this morning with that ticket on my chest and felt the spirit of victory inside it. I felt its weight. I felt it on me. I've won the lottery, says Adi. I assure you, I guarantee it. Oh, Adi, Clara says, bursting into tears again. Oh, Adi. Adi wraps his arms around his shaking mother and holds her close to his chest. Tears have begun to stream down his cheeks as well. It's happening, mother, Adi cries. It's happening right now. I've won. Oh, my Adi, Clara whispers through sobs. She clings desperately to her son, pressing her small body against his, as if she's terrified of what will happen to him when she lets go. So, you'll see in the story if he actually won the lottery or not, but I don't think it's giving anything away but to suggest that. So there are, again, so many different things about these dictators that I'd love to talk about, related to the central idea or just different questions about them historically, psychologically, the historical setting, and I'd love to just hear what anybody is interested in particular so we could talk about.
Since these dictators did depend on mythologizing themselves, and since they depended on revisionism and reinvention, was it difficult to research them, especially in their earlier life, and come up with some facts about them that helped you create these characters?
Yeah. It was difficult, but it was more than that. It was just really interesting. Biographies were obviously very helpful, but by and large, by the time you get to page 25 in a good biography, you're past the point I was doing it. So they were only helpful to a certain point. But then their later biographies suggest the kinds of conflicts and keys to their psychologies and problems that then you think back in I thought back in retrospect, okay, what's going on with them? How is that functioning? So, for example, Mao Zedong, his great contribution to Marxist thought was the idea of contradiction. He wrote an article called On Contradiction that kind of became one of the center tenets of Maoism, where he said, it's normal for everything to be contradicting all the time, and you have to, reconcile it constantly. And this is something that I started to see happening in his personal life as well. He would want different things all the time and feel different things, and they were opposing things. And it was kind of a problem that stayed with him his whole life. So I thought that those are the kinds of keys or problems that I thought, okay, well, this is probably something that was affecting him when he was an adolescent as well. And I came across an incident. All of these stories, just as a little offshoot, are suggested by little incidents I found in their biographies. Very frequently, there are a paragraph or a sentence in their biographies that I thought, aha, okay, so there's some story there. An incident where I felt like I could show Mao, in this case, feeling conflicting things. So he was, when he was 14 years old, he was married in an arranged marriage to a local woman, and a young woman. She was 20. And there were all these signs that on one hand, he wanted to be married and he wanted to sort of fulfill his Confucian obligations and familial obligations. But on the other hand, he didn't want that. And on one hand, he wanted to become this scholar and this stay with an education. But on another hand, he wanted to drop out of school and be this rebel. He wanted all these opposing things. And so I used these kind of key, in that sense, something that was struck to me by later events, and used it as the source of their character, and the conflict to drive the story, which is, I think, a conflict that drove them for their whole lives. And then there was a lot of just ancillary research done around the time period that you can't really get from the biographies. What was Hunan society like in China at that point, and there were all sorts of offshoots and kind of research to find that would help suggest, in that story, what would a marriage have looked like in a small village in China at that point, things like that. What was he reading? What were the kind of books being read? What were those books?
Two questions. One, did you interview anybody who knew any of these people in preparing this? And secondly, your characters come from vastly different cultures, from Russia, from China, from Southeast Asia. How did that influence your writing? Did you have to get into a different cultural context as you prepare to do this and not just go over the facts of their lives, but the culture in which they were embedded?
Yeah. I didn't interview anybody, no. But I watched a lot of documentary, and in certain cases, that was particularly helpful. Idi Amin allowed a French photographer and documentary maker to follow him around in Uganda, and that documentary is very, very telling, and that was very helpful into his character. So in a certain sense, it was like hearing the voice in some instances was really important. For each story, it was a complete immersion into the culture and into the background. And so I read all sorts of different kinds of materials that were related to the culture and to the history of the situation, the kinds of incidents and problems. In terms of the style of the writing itself, that I tried to keep consistent all the way through, with a few different rules. Although the cultural context and the way it determines the characters is very different in each story. In terms of the style of the prose and the style of the approach to the story, first of all, I said it all in the present tense. I really wanted to emphasize that they were people in transition, and as soon as you slip into the past tense, you start looking back on them from what we know of them in the future. And I wanted to erase that as much as possible and really emphasize the fact that these people, at this moment in their lives, like they must have felt, could be anybody. They had no idea they were going to become who they were going to become. And that was something that they shared. And I also took a bit of a distant and a bit of a cold approach to them. Like it's I wouldn't call this a very warm book. Like it's got a bit of a cold feel on them and a slightly distant feel on them, that I felt was just important for being able to look at, sort of stand away and look at them without judgment and without also necessarily identifying with them or empathy as well.
With respect to your research and looking at the character formation, did you find at all the absence or presence of a father impacting their approach to not only looking at themselves, but their outlook about their future? Yeah.
I mean, there were a few psychological consistencies that I found that I almost wished I hadn't found. They were so predictable in certain ways, and in respect to family lives. But I wanted to emphasize a couple of things. One, they did have these psychological backgrounds and these sort of familial backgrounds, some of which were consistent, which I'll get to, but also that they were in historical and cultural circumstances that were very important and had free will. So there were all these different things sort of working as a soup into their lives. But in terms of their familial backgrounds, quite a few of them had a situation where they had a father who either actively beat or hurt them or ignored them, and at the same time, a mother who doted on them and kind of thought they were the greatest thing in the world. And so they very frequently would have this kind of, not always, but very frequently they would have this kind of psychological mix of getting from one parent a sense of their own worthlessness and violence and anger, and from the other parent a sense of their own specialness and grandiosity. Both Stalin and Hitler had that. Idi Amin's had it to a certain extent. I mean, he was ignored by his father and abandoned by his father, and his mother had a series of boyfriend, father-like figures who ignored him as well. There's some people who weren't like that. I mean, Pol Pot didn't have that, but Mao again had it. So it was a consistent element that you'd see throughout their childhoods. Yeah.
You hear about writers who carry the people around with them after the last period has been put on the page. Does this happen to you, and how do you cope with it, considering the subject matter you chose? And at what point are you now?
Well, in my fears, I was going to find a lot in common with these people, and it was going to really upset me. But I was happy to see that I had just the normal human things in common with them. So I didn't really take them with me. Part of it, I think you can see in the style of it, is that I kept them at a distance from me. I was looking at them from a bit of a distance, and it was part of it was how they interested me. So I didn't really have that problem. And I think another part of it is the time of their lives when I focused on them. Inevitably, when I would be reading the biographies and the histories of their biographies and the histories of their regimes, I would hit a kind of depression wall where just you're reading about atrocity after atrocity. But I really only had to read those things once and get a sense of them. And then most of my time was spent on them at times of their lives when they hadn't done anything. And their societies were in flux. And so I wasn't writing about dictators, actually. I was writing about kids who just happened to become dictators. I mean, they didn't just happen to, but they weren't dictators. And it was very important for me to emphasize that they weren't, that they could have become something else. So it's part of why I was interested in them at that age is when they were so bad, it was so dark.
First, did you get to watch Triumph of the Will?
I saw some of it, not the whole thing. Yeah.
I saw some of it too. But when I watched that film, something that I found really disturbing was just like seeing all of these bits of footage of Hitler just like, smiling and waving to crowds and stuff. And I mean, like you said earlier, there were some of these, characters who seemed like soft-spoken, great people and stuff. And of course I realized that Triumph of the Will was a deliberate piece of propaganda, but at the same time, like you see somebody, smiling and waving to a crowd, and it just makes you think a little bit. And I see pictures of Hitler with his dog Blondie.
Mm-hmm.
Like, have you seen any of those pictures?
I think so. Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know if there's exactly a question there, but like, what does that make you think about? I guess. Yeah.
There was a series of articles that were in the New Yorker, I think in like maybe 1936 or 35, where an American journalist went to Germany and interviewed Hitler and spent a few days with Hitler. And the articles are essentially like Hitler went to lunch today, and Hitler talked to these people, and it's at a time when Germany was recovering economically, and he had some crazy anti-Semitic views, but he wasn't doing half of the things that he was going to do. And so to look at them now, they're shocking, and they're kind of horrifying articles to think about these people in these, to think about him in such a ordinary way. And these stories do a certain extent of that. I think that what that focuses on, what the problem is it's painful to humanize these people. It's an uncomfortable thing to do and to think about, because what they did was so outlandish, and it's affected everybody in this room probably personally, and so it's a painful thing to do, and it makes you think a little bit. Well, what's the point? So they were people. Who cares? But that humanization is again, I think it's very important to keep in mind in relationship to what they're doing. There are people who created all of these things, and they did it by dehumanizing themselves. I guess that's my real point is that they would have been just as they would have been kind of horrified with seeing themselves as normal people. And so when you normalize them, it's a bit of it works against what they did. They didn't normalize themselves. They blew themselves up. But it's I think, I'm sorry, I think you're right to point out the uncomfortableness of that experience.
One point and a question. These comments about how these criminals could be humanized, well, that is what they count on. Savage brutality and maudlin sentiment reside side by side in the same people. And the fact that a man whom I interviewed didn't want to step on a bug because he didn't want to kill a living thing, and yet he had savagely murdered somebody. These exist side by side within the same individual.
Yeah.
My question is, I thought you said these people could have been somebody other than what they became. Did you say that?
I did, yeah.
I'd love to hear how that could be.
Well, in the sense that it is pretty hard to imagine some of them being people you'd like to be good people. I mean, or you'd like to have dinner with. I can't imagine Hitler turning out as anything other than a crazy person, and Stalin as anything other than a really brutal person. A viciously brutal person. But he certainly didn't have to do it on that scale, and he certainly didn't have to be, he didn't have to have 30 million people dead because of him. So, well, first of all, I think that there are different rules for different people. I do think that Saloth Sor, the guy who became Pol Pot, could have become somebody else. I don't think that he was brutal in the way that Hitler was or Stalin was. But I do think that in terms of being dictators, being people in control of a country, so much has to happen that isn't just psychology and natural instinct. And all of those things have to play in part. I probably agree with you that there are a certain number of these people who would just, they would have been awful people no matter what, but they didn't have to be awful people in that way. That's really what I mean. And they also do have choice all the way through about how awful they want to be. I mean, like, every single psychopath out there has a choice of just how psychopathic they want to be. Like, you could be minorly psychopathic or majorly psychopathic, and you do have some choice.
In your stories, are there choices evident in the stories that they made that sort of led in a direction? Was that revealed? There
are choices that they make in every story that are indicative of the kinds of choices they would make throughout their lives that made them who they were. But there are no epiphanies in the story. There are no moments. They're not stories of they start the story as not dictators and they end, on the way. There's a movie, Max. Did anyone see the movie Max about young Hitler as an artist? I like the movie a lot, but it also really irritated me because there's this moment in it where he's got this artistic ambition and he's going, and then he kind of gets let down at one key moment in his life about his artistic vision, and he storms off, and that's it, right? Like, so he's giving up on that, and he decides to choose politics instead of art. There's just no way that it happened like that in the real world, and there's no way that if it did, that I'm interested in it. It's a lifelong process, and so those kinds of choices are about patterns and ways you consistently make choices. And so in each story, there are problems that they face and ways of dealing with those problems that are they're the same problems that they deal with throughout their lives, and the way they deal with it is indicative of how they will on a larger scale later in their lives. But the problems themselves, the way they manifest, and the ways of solving it are much smaller because they don't have any power. They have the consequences of whatever 16-year-old events, or 14 or 19.
I have two questions. One, were there any of these where you found yourself thinking, this is just too hard, I can't do this one? And second, and some of the other questions kind of touched on this, but does this change the way you look at teenagers?
No, in terms of the too hard, because I have a very kind of sort of bread and butter materialist view of the world, and I kind of, whenever I read stuff that was gross, I always was aware of the fact that I was usually reading it in a library and often with a latte. like my actual experience was not bad. And so and then again, when I was writing them, I was focused on times when they weren't those monsters. I would have had a harder time. I mean, like, one of the things I read was Trujillo, who is a terrible guy. In The Feast of the Goat, Mario Vargas Llosa's novel, he writes a lot of it is about the last day in the life of Trujillo. And so there's long segments of him, and he was at his worst at that point. I mean, he was totally calcified as a murderer, rapist, awful guy. That would have been much harder for me to write, I think, than the Trujillo that I wrote, which was kind of an awful kid. I mean, definitely an awful kid, but a teenager, and who hadn't done all the terrible things yet, so it wasn't as much. In terms of, does it make me think differently about teenagers? No. Every now and then you come across a teenager, you think. But most of them aren't dictators. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.